Mhm.
Hello. Today I will be giving the eighth lecture in our course, which is, mm, as you see, titled as Europeanization, Geopolitics, and Politics of Gender and Sexuality, the case of Georgia. I'm Tamar Tzkhadadze. I'm an associate professor at Ilia State University and also a director of Gender Research Center here. The aim of today's lecture will be to discuss various ways in which the EU aspirations or integration into East European, into Western and Atlantic structures in East European and post-Soviet states and states interact with geopolitical tensions and conflicts in the region, and how these two confound and interact with and shape politics of gender and sexuality in these societies. The focus of my talk today will be Georgia. However, I will try to make some parallels with some Eastern European countries and especially with Ukraine. The three concepts that I mentioned in the title are Europeanization, geopolitics, and the politics of gender and sexuality. I believe they don't need much explanation, but I will spend a few seconds just to pinpoint what exactly I mean by this. The Europeanization usually is referred by Europeanization, scholars refer to the process of construction, diffusion, and institutionalization of rules, being formal or informal, procedures, policy paradigms, styles, ways of doing things, and the list goes on, and shared beliefs and norms by European Union to its neighboring countries. I'm taking this definition from Shevtsova 22, which is in main readings for this lecture. Geopolitics, on the other hand, I won't start explaining the term itself, but why it's important for our class today is that the process of Europeanization has been very tightly entangled with the question of geopolitical choice and national security in East European countries and also in post-Soviet republics. It was especially on the backdrop of the threats being military or not so explicitly military from Russia. So it has never been just a civilization. Europeanization has never been just a civilizational choice, as sometimes it is framed, but essentially was linked with the national security concerns and expected benefits from the integration in EU and NATO in this respect. And finally, by the politics of gender and sexuality, I mean in the widest sense an array of activities, initiatives, discourses, causes for women's rights, LGBTQI rights, and gender equality. Ever since gaining independence in early 1990s in Georgia, these issues were very closely linked with the aspirations of Western integration of our state. And LGBTQI rights are most intricately linked with Europeanization and geopolitics throughout past 15 or so years, I will claim. Now, when discussing these issues and interplay and interactions between these, of course, it's important to make clear which actors we will be addressing. Of course, this list of actors can be much longer, could be much longer, but I will concentrate on USA and international donor organizations, local governments, also local women's rights and LGBTQI activists, as well as civil society organizations in general, some of them not necessarily focused on LGBTQI rights and gender equality issues. Also, important actors in these processes are local political elites, governing or oppositional, uh, local conservative, far-right or anti-gender groups and anti-gender groups and movements, and Georgian Orthodox Church, which is the dominant church in our country, gaining its political and societal influence ever since Georgia became independent in early 1990s. Of course, there are lots of talks and suspicions about of Russia being one of the main actors in these processes. However, unfortunately, I won't be able to address Russia as an actor in these talks. Now, according to many scholars, it is widely accepted now, this classification, that Western and also international donor strategies for Europeanization in these new democracies, as they are sometimes called, have been threefold. All scholars identify three different strategies for Europeanization. One is conditionality, which is the EU strategy to establish specific conditions or preconditions, such as democratic rule or practices, and to negotiate with local governments, introducing those and reforming institutions or introducing the new legislation to comply with EU standards and norms. The corresponding EU institutions regularly are supposed at least to regularly monitor domestic adoption and development of these in targeted countries, and in case of compliance, they reward states with financial or institutional assistance and or with association promises or actual association agreements, and ultimately prospects of full EU membership. The second strategy isolated by scholars is persuasion. In this case, EU is acting as a global model, using persuasion to convince other countries of the importance of adoption of European norms. And this third strategy identified is capacity building, which implies financial, technical, and political assistance the EU is providing to domestic actors that are able to promote institutional changes. Now, of course, these three strategies here are mainly referring to EU. However, we can extrapolate it to other Western agents as well, like United States agencies for international development also have been important actors in the region, and they also use pretty much the same strategies for their aims. Now, it has been also a topic of agreement among scholars that historically, conditionality has been the main strategy or the most effective strategy for EU in Europeanization processes. Even though we need to admit that Western donors and EU has spent significant resources for persuasion and capacity building in Georgia, supporting local civil society and governments, as well as information campaigns, researchers agree that conditionality has been the main instrument for a long time. And it's also important when speaking about effectiveness and uses of the strategy of conditionality, the fact that it depends on what is at stake and what is on offer from EU. For example, in case of Georgia in 90s, it was the membership in the Council of Europe that was the main incentive for our government, then government, to abolish capital punishment, also to introduce some legal changes. In 2010, when Georgia was actively negotiating the association agreement with the European Union, And together with the association agreement, visa liberalization for Georgian citizens was discussed. Those promises were very critical for promoting some important reforms, including those concerning LGBTQI rights and gender equality. Now I will return to this point at the end of my talk. But one would expect that since the promise of EU membership has become more tangible after Russia started a full-scale war in Ukraine, you would have gained more leverage for and more resources for using conditionality strategies. However, I will discuss how the context has changed and how the logic of conditionality in connection with the EU candidacy prospects are different now. Now, of course, we could have talked about Europeanization in many other respects. Or my main topic today is connection of Europeanization with the politics of gender and sexuality in Georgia. And as I already mentioned, probably among various aspects of the politics of gender and sexuality, LGBTQI rights are most salient in recent decade or 15 years. So in what I will say, the main emphasis will be on LGBTQI rights and LGBTQ activism. Now, many authors who research Eastern European and post-Soviet societies credit European Union's conditionality politics with giving salience to LGBTQI rights and being the main drivers for their politicization. For example, you can see this claim made by Shevtsova. In her words, the EU deserves the credit for making LGBTQI rights a political issue. However, my claim is that in some cases, and in Georgia, for example, it can be argued that the mentioned politicization was started by other actors earlier, and EU conditionality politics was, in a sense, reaction to it. And also an important catalyst in this process. However, I would not really say that it was the EU who started this politicization. In case of Georgia, EU-West support for LGBTQI rights was mainly restricted to persuasion and capacity building until 2010, and it remained quite under radar of the national politics. EU and other Western donors supported a handful of LGBTQI community organizations, and those resources were quite scarce. On the other hand, for LGBTQI activists themselves, of course, European aspirations were an important instrument for framing arguments for their own rights. But even by them, conditionality was not really hoped for in early 2000s. It was conservative far-right actors led by the Orthodox Church of Georgia that started politicization of LGBTQI rights in Georgia. Even when there was almost no LGBTQ activism in Georgia, they started organizing rallies against allegedly planned LGBT rights and also campaigning against same-sex marriages. I want to emphasize that those counter protests or counter rallies by far-right organizations preceded in Georgia any initiatives on the part of LGBTQ community or their rights defenders. It can be argued that this was just a case of populist appeal to conservative sentiments rather than that of politicization, but my claim will become clearer later. What I mean is that, of course, we could one prima facie way to look at those activities of far-right groups could be seen as a simple backlash against LGBTQI rights. However, I would say that considering the context is very important, and we will see things differently. Actually, events of May 17 of 2013, I think we are turning point for politicization of LGBTQI rights in Georgia. Maybe some of you know, however, I will just recap very shortly that in 2013, conservative groups led by the Georgian Orthodox Church gathered tens of thousands, according to some estimates, 100,000 of counter-protesters against a handful of LGBTQI right activists who were gathering on May 17 for International Day Against Homophobia. Why was it politicization, and why not to see it simply as a conservative backlash? As I said, to understand this, it's important to look at some details of the immediate context. Actually, just a couple prior on May 17, probably it started about a week earlier, the church and church-affiliated groups started issuing warnings that they would not allow LGBTQI activists to hold a march or gathering. Actually, it was not a big march, but as I said, just a gathering of maybe 20, 30 activists. They would not allow this to happen in public spaces in Tbilisi. In response to this, our government and then our prime minister, Bidzina Ivanishvili, held a press conference in which he expressed his explicit support for not specifically LGBTQI rights, however, for their freedom of speech and assembly. And here you have a quote from his quote from this press conference. We will do everything to ensure that rights of minorities are protected. Sexual minorities are citizens just like any of us. The society will get used to this sooner or later. There are people who cannot accept this, and that is why there are law enforcement structures in the state. Those are exact words of Bidzina Ivanishvili, then Prime Minister of Georgia. There were also several other high-profile politicians from the ruling party who also supported the Idaho event and also condemned those threats coming from the church and church-affiliated groups. In response, the church mobilized huge crowds in the streets after, as I said, previously issuing warning statements. So, of course, this event of the May 17 in 2013 can be viewed in from many different perspectives, but one very obvious and salient feature of this dynamics is that it was actually somehow power struggle and power negotiation between the church and conservative groups on the one hand and the ruling party, Georgian Dream, on the other hand. I also want to give just additional aspects of the political context. Then Georgian Dream had probably been ruling party for less than a year then. And actually, when Georgian Dream came to power, they mobilized support from conservative groups who were opposed to our previous government. So Georgian Dream at that time was very eclectic. So in reactions to May 17, now we are very different from you, Western. Actually, it was just the decisive event, I claim, that increased the interest and the concern of EU and Western donors to homophobia and LGBTQI rights initiatives in Georgia. On the other hand, Georgian civil society organizations also started paying more attention to LGBTQI rights. As I mentioned, if previously only a handful of specialized organizations were working with these rights, after 2013, more funding became available on the one hand, but on the other hand, many mainstream human rights NGOs also started doing research on homophobia and included LGBTQI rights explicitly on their agenda. Government initiated investigation but did not pursue it properly. However, the leadership condemned the violence, and political parties in opposition also started explicitly supporting, some of them, not all of them, supporting LGBTQI rights, but they mostly used it as an argument against the ruling party. So many LGBTQI rights activists saw this as instrumentalizing the communities needs for their political purposes. Since I'm almost out of time, I will just skip this slide. No, actually, we can see the conditionality at work in the first half of 2010s, when Georgia was, as I mentioned, actively negotiating the association agreement. Conditionality at work, we can see in the fact that Georgian parliament passed the law against discrimination, in which the possible basis of discrimination, among other possible bases, sexual orientation, gender identity, and expression were explicitly listed, which caused a huge backlash from conservative parts of our societies, and the government publicly declared the reason for adopting this anti-discrimination law in its existing form, that it was EU association agreement conditions. There were some important legislative changes in those years, such as labor code, mandatory gender quotas for political parties, later legislation on sexual harassment. However, in case of the law against discrimination, they almost officially and for sure publicly explained their decision with the reference to the conditions for European Association Agreement. However, on the other hand, soon after that, in 2017, the Parliament of Georgia passed a set of constitutional changes, among which one of the most debated was definition of marriage. They redefined marriage as the union of a man and a woman with the aim of starting a family. In previous constitution, there was no mention of the sexes of possible spouses. And what is more interesting is that the official justifications of this amendment that restricted marriage right to heterosexual couples was the government's aspirations not to eliminate obstacles to European integration. The Speaker of our parliament, Irakli Kobakidze, justified the legislative change as an attempt to neutralize arguments of anti-Western groups. These are his exact words. Our main task is to give no excuse to certain groups for inciting homophobic or anti-Western sentiments. To sum up what I said, so LGBTQI rights politicization was mainly driven by far-right conservative groups and politicians, though the European Union did play an important role of a catalyst. Far-right backlash against LGBTQI rights increased their support by pro-Western politicians, EU Western agencies, and big human rights civil society organizations, which also implied more funding and more salience for LGBTQI issues. This trend is observed in many other countries too. EU conditionality politics did yield some positive changes, mainly legislative, without the government truly committing to the realization of LGBTQI rights. And these reforms were perceived externally imposed or as a mere technicality to satisfy formal requirements of EU and presented as such even by the government. These legislative changes and increased visibility of LGBTQI issues also contributed to further polarization of the public and also increased the risks of violence against LGBTQI persons, as well as they contributed to further politicization of the issue. Finally, the link between Europeanization as well as EU integration aspirations on the one hand and LGBTQI rights on the other hand were firmly cemented, consequences of which, in fact, are still unfolding in today's reality. Now, I will skip about this. For far-right mobilization, gender equality is, of course, and has been for a long time an important issue. But I share the opinion of many researchers who emphasize that this mobilization should not be seen only as a backlash, conservative backlash against LGBTQI rights or women's rights. There is a lot of huge body of interesting scholarship about how gender is used by far-right groups for their political purposes without having any particular meaning or significance. One thing that I want to stress now is that in respect of the EU aspirations or Europeanization in general, Georgian far-right has been playing some kind of double game. On the one hand, of course, demonizing liberal pervert Europe and also appealing to conservative, but on the other hand, also, and at the same time, appealing to good conservative Europe that is subjugated by global liberal elites, but recently gaining strength. Actually, this observation is also echoed by Martin Moss' analysis of East European far-right, who emphasizes that far-right claims actually are not necessarily anti-European. I'm quoting, anti-gender politics is often a surprisingly pro-European phenomenon, writes Moss. Many of its practitioners rebuff accusations of Euroscepticism. For them, rights restrictions are less an attempt to reject European integration than to redirect its trajectory. They aim to reconnect the EU with Europe's civilizational roots. Actually, that's very much what we are witnessing in Georgia and on far right too. They, as I said, on the one hand, blame European corruption, but on the other hand, also appeal to conservative groups and far-right groups in Europe as true Europeans with whom they seek alliances. European far-right and conservative forces are important for their local counterparts in many respects. On the one hand, for resources, material, as well as discursive, they take arguments, narratives, frames, fake news from them, but also for self-legitimizing purposes. Appeal to global alliances is one. For example, it was very widely publicized World Congress of Families that was held in Tbilisi, hosted by our far-right groups in 2016. And that's my, I think, more important point, appeal to the normativity of the West. As in Georgia, West is still an object of aspiration. Most polls of public opinion show that Georgian society is pro-Western, and also discursively, West has a normative value and meaning in Georgia. And far-right groups are using this Western normativity by appealing to their counterparts in the West, so not necessarily posing as anti-Western as such. And good examples of these strategies can be found in legal initiatives started by them. In almost all cases, they justify their legal initiatives by appeals to their European analogs. And however, recent developments are important. On the one hand, we are talking about far-right groups and their strategies, but another thing is to talk about what scholars term state-sponsored homophobia, in which case state is using homophobia as a political instrument for national building and political power legitimization. If in early 2010s, Georgian government was not explicitly aligning itself with far-right groups and conservative groups. I would say that a drastic turn happened some time around. Of course, it's difficult to pinpoint an exact date, around 2021 probably, and immediate confirmation of that was July 5 events when far-right conservative groups rallied and violently rallied against Georgian Pride group and its other supporters. And Irakli Garibashvili, then our prime minister, virtually encouraged those far-right groups' violence. Since the war in Ukraine started, actually, a new candidacy became a real option. The government has even more drastically changed its politics and started using political homophobia even more explicitly. But this time already, or in conjunction with its link with the European Union and using it for demonization of European Union as well. Now their beloved topic is national sovereignty, so the national sovereignty, under which rubric they mean mainly European Union imposing legislations to neighboring countries. Example of this is their transparency law that they passed recently, but also a law to protect family values and children that is virtually a Russian law to ban LGBT propaganda. It's interesting that in this context and under the frame of national sovereignty, Georgian Dream government is on the one hand criticizing and antagonizing EU, but on the other hand promising the society to join EU, but this time on our own terms. Those are their exact phrases. And I think I'm out of time now. I wanted also to say a couple of words about LGBTQ rights defenders and activists' position in this context. However, I will be just very short and make just my main point. In this conjuncture, when the government is weaponizing this link or knot between Europeanization and LGBTQI activists, and on the other hand, really supporting active homophobia, many pro-Western agents, including LGBTQI activists, face this dilemma to be vocal or to stay silent on the one hand, and also face this fact that this knot between European Union and LGBTQI rights has backfired. Now, most pro-Western agents' strategy is to avoid the topic of LGBTQI rights to somehow retain public support for European integration. I will finish with this and thank you for listening. And I hope this will give you some thought for some food for further thoughts, even though I wasn't able to finish what I was planning.